Welcome everyone, my name is Jordan Farmer and this is the Uncommon Ground YouTube channel where we are indoctrinating the masses every single day. And today is episode 8 of the Uncommon Ground podcast, and I'm going to be tackling the war on drugs issue generally within a political framework. First and foremost, this is an extremely controversial topic. Because of abuse, because of addiction and the intertwining of that, lots and lots of people hate drugs. Lots and lots of people have seen people in their lives lose their lives to drugs or lose their self to drugs. We've all seen that person who looks like they're 50 and they're actually 28 and they've just been a 10-year meth addict, or whatever it may be. It's a tragic topic is the point, so I want to acknowledge that going in. It's a very tense, very tragic topic. Now, moving on, from a political context, or at least from a legal context, we have a full spectrum of legal to illegal drugs. So I want to lay that out first. On the far illegal side, you have stuff like fentanyl. Well, not even, okay. On the far illegal end, you have things that are absolutely illegal, and if you have them in your possession, you will probably go to jail. Like, almost guaranteed you're going to go to jail. And then there's just stuff that's absolutely illegal, but they just use it kind of to issue you tickets and fees, like marijuana in many states, and just try to rack up revenue for the state. And then you have, like, legal, but only under very, very, very strict conditions. Being like prescription drugs, high-level prescription drugs. That's why fentanyl kind of exists. A lot of these drugs exist through spectrums, because obviously there's illegal and illegal contexts for them. So you have absolutely illegal, then you have somewhat illegal, but not that serious. Then you have legal, but barely. Then you have legal, but you have to be licensed in some way to get access to it. Like, there's certain medications and drugs and stuff that that people have to have training in terms of using those drugs or using those substances in order to be able to handle them. Then you have like over-the-counter legal drugs, so it can be sold pretty much anywhere, but I think you have to be 18 and older, but it can pretty much be sold anywhere, and they're not that dangerous, and they're pretty well regulated as well in terms of purity. You're not going to get contaminants very often. You know what you're getting. It's very well regulated. It's awesome, the whole deal. And then you have like the bodybuilding industry and supplements, which are often have drugs or compounds in them, and that is like completely unregulated, but also completely legal and open. There are occasionally companies that get shut down because they make mistakes or they do improper things with their manufacturing, or they're caught to be lying about what's in their stuff or whatever. But for the most part, it's very unregulated, very, very open, wild, wild west. So that's kind of the spectrum. You have the full spectrum of just stuff that's like unregulated but totally legal, all the way to totally illegal. And each of these different stages has different effects and impacts in terms of enforcement and resources and law enforcement, things like that. So it's a bit complicated, but knowing that that's the spectrum, some of those categories are very bad for society pretty much across the board. Some of them are slightly dangerous for society, and some of them seem to be right there in that moderate policy happy middle ground. That moderate policy happy middle ground is, for me, would either exist exclusively within the over-the-counter drug market, so it's regulated and certified for purity standards. Third-party certifications could be mandated. That's a free market approach to it. And then those third parties would be legally liable if they fail to test, and if a bad batch of supplement makes it out to market, they would be legally liable as the third-party testers. Like, there would be some liability for the manufacturer, but they would be liable because they are legally certifying it. Anyways, or you could just have normal regulatory agencies. I don't care all that much. I just, we're arguing over really, really mundane, innocuous policy at that point. But yeah, so over-the-counter, regulated, purity standards, the whole deal, very, very safe. And there's a lot, and then you could have some sort of funding mechanism to make sure that there's lots and lots of studies and research out on those substances so that people know what they're getting involved in. And then you can have some substances that maybe are more dangerous and just can't be held without expertise being involved. Those can be within the licensing and the prescription domains. But I don't believe that it is particularly worthwhile for law enforcement. So I'm going to tackle this issue from a bunch of different perspectives, but we'll start with the most obvious. We have limited jail space. We have limited police officers. That will always be the case. We can hire more, but that will always be the case. So we always have to, if we're being honest and analytical, have to prioritize resources within law enforcement to get them into the areas that need to be handled top priority. And then as we have extra resources, then we can look at these other things. But there has to be some sort of sense of priority there. That overlaps with just the observation that we have sex offenders on every corner. If you search your neighborhood, you have sex offenders in every corner, especially if you live in a poor neighborhood. So you're at a heightened danger of being victimized for an extra reason beyond just being poor. But even beyond that, we have drug addicts behind bars, in jail, in prison. That that observation of the world and that contrast is just sickening. That we have addicts behind bars, but sex offenders and rapists and child rapists out on the streets. It's insane. It's just insane. Moving on to brighter topics. We have to prioritize who we use our law enforcement to pursue. We have to prioritize who we put in our jails. And if you don't do that, you're not thinking about the issue. Or you're thinking about it in some way that I can't comprehend. That somehow still makes sense. Or it just doesn't make sense. One of those options. So that being said, if we're going to prioritize jail and law enforcement resources, drug addicts, drug dealers, drug users, generally, not just addicts, those aren't exactly the kind of people that are worthy of being thrown in a cage and having their lives turned upside down when you compare them to the murderers, rapists, sex offenders, gang members that are involved in active shootings and drive-by shootings and all that kind of stuff. That class of violent crime is in the top tier, and it should be prioritized by our law enforcement, number one. Like the majority, if not all of our resources should go there first. Then you have theft, which is more of an you have to have a certain value / intellectual sort of approach to understand why theft is bad. Not obviously people intuitively understand why theft is bad, but to be able to articulate it is a different issue. When you give up your labor and your life, the time in your life in exchange for money, then you use that value to then get something and that thing is stolen, there's a chain there that leads to someone stealing your life and your labor away from you, ultimately. It was in the form of this TV that you stole from me, but I worked 10 hours of my life in order to be able to pay for that little tiny TV. So you're stealing that 10 hours of my life away from me. And that ties a little bit into the taxation is theft thing, which I think is an exaggeration, but fun to explore, but that's a topic for a different day. So you have violent crime, then theft, and then you have what I would call suboptimal behavior that is victimless outside of yourself, but society really, really still hates. And that is... So when most people have issues or have concerns from a political perspective as it relates to drug use, drug addiction, and all those kinds of things, it comes from one of two positions. A, like, I don't want you to be a loser who's addicted, so I don't want you to lose your life, I don't want you to be addicted. The other side is the actual criminality that comes with, that can sometimes come with people who are trying to support their habit as an addict. They will commit crimes in order to try to service that habit. Those are pretty much the only two real concerns that people have. If we really thought that every single person who ever did drugs deserved to go to jail, then, we'd have an insanely high prison population. And again, what you consider drugs is a very, very tricky deal. Lots and lots of people have lost themselves to prescription drugs. Lots and lots of people have found themselves with illicit drugs. Lots and lots of people have been fine trying it randomly and just moving on with their lives. There's a full spectrum. So, this whole subject falls in between those two tiers, in between those two second tiers, not the top one. There's no violent crime involved, but you can have theft and some violent crime, I guess, in support of drug addiction. So there can be this overlap and this tie with greater criminality, but they are distinct. So to treat them as the same doesn't make sense to me, and to think that because you do one, you will do the other. Also, it's not, the evidence isn't there. The numbers don't back that up. Otherwise, we'd have a lot more murderers. So we need to separate out those more violent things as violent themselves, and then we need to just understand that the drug addiction issue is below that theft line. And when you're going to have law enforcement responding to a crime... Okay, so this is getting a little bit big picture, but this is related to what should and should not be legal versus illegal generally, not just within the drug context. My guiding principles on this comes from 2 observations, or 3, depending on how you want to count it. The first one is just that there is a hierarchy of crime. Human beings can do wrong to each other, and that can be very, very small, that can be medium, and that can get large, and that can get really, really intense and really, really evil. And that's when you start getting into the murder and rapist tiers. But there's this hierarchy. So there's this gradient, and when you have law enforcement responding to a crime, they respond to that crime with force that comes in one of 2 forms that actually is within that hierarchy of wrongdoings against other human beings, or crimes that I'm referring to, that I believe we all can perceive. When you physically arrest someone, take them out of their life and put them in a cage and hold them there for a bit, that's essentially kidnapping. You're violating someone's sovereignty as a human being, and you're saying, you are under our control now, we're going to go take you away regardless of what you wanted to do, and against your will. We're going to take you away. That's kidnapping. If whatever you did is not even remotely close to as bad as kidnapping, and the government, the state, the law enforcement, the police officers, the cops, they kidnap you, essentially. They violate your individual sovereignty to a greater degree than you did to anyone else in the first place. That is government committing a greater crime than the original perpetrator in response to that initial crime, which makes the world worse objectively. Human beings are treated worse for that policy being implemented. And that's a pretty low bar, man. Kidnapping relative to, many other crimes. Kidnapping's not nothing, but, kidnapping it covers a lot. The second point is when the government gives you a ticket or fees, anything of that sort. That is all theft. They are stealing your money from you against your will. You are losing your labor value, your life that you sacrificed to the state for this behavior. So it's theft and kidnapping, arrest and fines. If whatever you did is not as bad as either of those two things, and that is how the government responds to you, I believe that means the government is making the world a morally worse place, an objectively worse place, committing a worse crime than was initially perpetrated, and it should just not happen. Law enforcement should not get involved where their involvement is worse than whatever happened in the first place. That's the most easy way to understand it. So, drugs and drug use and even drug sales and even being an addict, all of that falls below theft from a moral perspective. So there should be no, so this is where I'm coming full circle. What I've kind of explained a little bit, or started to explain, is that when you have illegal drugs, there's tremendous damage that takes place to people that get caught in the system. A lot of their money gets stolen, a lot of their time gets stolen. They never get that back. Often their behavior isn't really changed a whole lot. Like if you're an addict and you have your life turned upside down, disrupted, and you're broke, do you really think you're less likely to turn to your vices at that point, or more likely? Unless you genuinely believe that anyone who gets a boo-boo changes their behavior, and anyone who gets punished by daddy deserves it. And I hate to phrase it that way. I hate to have so much like anger coming through here, but it really is. It's really messed up that we have this idea that if you did a boo-boo or a bad, that you need to be punished like you're a child. And again, when I say that, I'm saying that intentionally dismissively. I'm not talking about murder or rape or anything serious. I'm talking about the stuff that doesn't affect anyone other than you. And here's another point. If you're an addict, you're struggling already. You don't need people to wait. You don't need an arrest and a record and fines and ostracism and people hating you and judgment and trauma on top of your addiction. Does that make any sense to anyone who thinks about it for 2 seconds that way? Of course not. But we don't think about it that way. We're like, oh, they're bad. They're criminals. This is one of the areas where I get the most emotional and the most angry at Republicans and right-wingers. Because they have this concept of criminal that they latch onto. And so if it's criminal, if it's against the law, it's bad, you're a bad person. They might not always say it that way, but that's how they feel, that's how they think, that's the way they act, that's the way they react to anyone who is a criminal. Even though what is illegal versus legal is literally what we decide is legal versus illegal. There's no moral, like the law and legal systems have to conform to morality, not the other way around. I used to say you couldn't legislate morality, but that was an unsophisticated position. What I meant was like innocuous things like drug addiction, or drug use, or even drinking wine or whatever. It's such a small part of your life, and whether or not you think it's a good or bad moral decision in that sense, you can't just legislate what you think is the best morality or what you think is best. That was what I was trying to say before, but that was not quite sophisticated enough. Legal systems have to conform to universal morality that I believe is perceivable and understandable once you've gone through enough steps and done the philosophical work, or at least heard people do the philosophical work. And a lot of what I say is very, very simple, because I don't want you to be able to escape what I'm saying, because I'm trying to just describe the reality from a perspective that highlights certain things, definitely, so it's not purely objective. But in a certain, like when I'm thinking about these things, I just want to understand them. I don't care what the truth is. I really don't. I just want to know what it is. But I'm not attached to it. I'm not predicting it. I don't expect it. Okay. All right. I went on a bit of a ramble there. But my point was, because earlier I said that there's the over-the-counter and prescription zone, and that is what is good for society, and that things outside of it are bad for society. The things that are outside of it that are bad for society, number one, is all this damage that the state does to people that are criminals for having used these substances. But also, with the bodybuilding thing, you have a lot of substances, you have a lot of compounds that have things in them that there's no accountability for. You have a very unregulated market, and again, you don't have to have government involved in order to have purity. Okay, the government doesn't have to have a agency doing the testing itself in order to ensure that there's a minimal level of standard or quality within the marketplace. There are other ways of going about that. There are free market, like state mandated free market solutions to this issue. I don't even know where I was going with that. The bodybuilding market has some dangers to it. The illegal drug market has dangers to it, but what's funny is it's not really the illegal drugs that are the danger. Like the first off, the danger of the things in bodybuilding supplements is not that much of a danger. Like if you're taking creatine and it's got a little bit of extra something in there to get you extra strong and whatever, and you weren't planning on it, you probably aren't going to feel it. It's probably not even going to be enough. Often it's just trace amounts of stuff. It's not actual compounds they're putting it in. But I'm ranting. But anyways, those kinds of aspects of the market, the black market, and then this like sort of wild west market, those have certain dangers and costs associated with them. And so we should try to avoid those and try to fit everything into the legal framework, the above board, real market, not a black market, not feeding the cartel. Okay. So, yeah, that's the ideal. Now, I'm going to go into two stages. One, is it really better for the people to legalize all drugs? Because that's what I'm asking for. I didn't want to lead with that because it sounds insane. But hopefully, if you've gotten this far into this podcast, you understand that I'm not insane. Or you really understand that I'm insane. Sorry. That's pretty creepy now, huh? I'm laughing after saying that. Is it actually better for people? And what was the other side of that? Okay, I'll just address that first point first. Is it actually better for people? Well, the metrics to establish that, first and foremost, would be rates of addiction, rates of overdoses, rates of suicides associated with addiction and those kinds of things, and then criminal behavior associated with drug use. On all of those metrics, when you look at countries like Portugal, specific states in the United States, or the Netherlands, or many other countries, what you find is that when you have freedom, and freedom is actually the solution, you're actually much better off as a society on all of those metrics. It's much better. Now, here's my sort of common sense explanation as to why, and you can agree with it or disagree with it. I don't care. If you, as a culture, decide to say, instead of saying, so there's like three basic directions you can go when responding to drugs as a society and as a parent. There's the never ever do it, and you hope that works, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And then there's the try it eventually, and then that is broken down into two different things. Try it when you haven't planned on it, or at a party under bad circumstances when you drink too much, and you sort of trial by fire. And then there's my ideal, and the ideal that seems to be the evidence seems to back up, and that is you should learn how to use drugs and how to use discernment to know when you should and shouldn't use a drug before you ever get involved in drugs, or that is how you're introduced to drugs. So like when it comes to alcohol, the safest way for someone to learn how to drink is at home with their parents having a beer at 15, 16. And then they have one beer, then they have a couple, then they have a few more, etc. if you just go to a party randomly with a bunch of strangers and you're pressured into drinking way too much and you get super wasted, a lot of bad things can happen, a lot of dysfunction, and that's a terrible way to start drinking because you have no sense of what you like. You're pushing yourself to the limit from the jump instead of calibrating and ratcheting your way up, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but like it does have negative consequences and it's not optimal. So my point is just societies that embrace this and say you should learn how to use drugs effectively and smartly and learn when you shouldn't use drugs, and it's all about the individual making their own choices and learning. That is the best approach across the board. Better to learn how to properly use things the right way through the right process than any other alternative. Okay. Okay, so it's better for society. So, one of those things was, is it better for society? The other thing that I mentioned briefly was the cartel issue. What people don't understand is when you have a black market, all that means is that criminals are now in charge of the industry. Act like technical criminals, actual criminals, people that are regularly involved in low-level crime. White-collar crime, or like the sense that, the big banksters and stuff, or the big, the Illuminati, that kind of criminality, that's not what I'm referencing. I'm talking about like normal criminals, gangs, the mafia, stuff like that, cartels. When you have a black market, criminals will be in charge of the black market. So the power of that industry, first off, the industry is going to be worth more because it's more dangerous to get involved in. So the profits are higher, and so the profits are higher, like typically, because the prices are higher in those circumstances. But the power of the industry fuels that criminal organization because they have an industry to fuel their organization, and only criminals can do it. So they're competing with the other criminal factions for that industry. If you take that away from them, they lose a tremendous amount of their power. And I keep jumping onto things, but this is a little golden nugget I'll give you. It is impossible to fight a modern military engagement without industrial might. What does that mean? You gotta have money to fight an expensive war. Because the military, and because of the military-industrial complex, the good side of it, we've industrialized military and fighting. Which means that if a cartel or mafia or terrorist organization, or even just a country that's a bad actor on the world stage, if they don't have industry, they've been declawed and had their teeth taken. They can't do anything. You can't fund the missiles and the guns and the personnel and the kinds of things that you need as a criminal organization or as a terrorist organization or as a mafia or any of that without the industrial base underneath. So this applies to like countries like Iran that apparently are or have been funding terrorist organizations for like 15 years, at least, if not longer. I don't have a good sense of the actual time scale. I just know that it's at least in the last 15 years that they've been known to be doing this. If you sanction them and cut them off to the world economy and make it so that anyone who does trade with them also gets cut off from the world economy, and you isolate them, they will become extremely poor. They won't be able to fund the terrorism. They won't be able to fund their own military. They won't be able to be a real problem on the world stage. They calling me. Likewise, criminal organizations won't have the resources that they need in order to be able to do their business, to be able to compete, and to be able to give law enforcement additional problems. So, for all the reasons, legalize all the drugs. Okay? Thank you. Thank you for listening. Email me at modernmoderatenews@gmail.com if you want to ask me any questions, and peace. And we cannot forget that we can use government funding to fund rehabilitation. So, rehabilitation before incarceration for drug addicts. That is the positive policy that we can push for that will help the people that need it.